Hey guys, welcome to Reading Hour with Salazar. Just kidding, it won't really take an hour. But I wanted to give you guys some strategies for these novel quizzes that we're doing. So this is for chapter 5 of Harriet Tubman. So I'm going to as we read, I'll write down some notes, which is one of my strategies. But my very first strategy is picking the place where I read. So I'm currently in my room. I have this like chair that I do some reading on, and it kind of helps me focus. If I read on my bed, I sometimes end up falling asleep. If I read in my living room, then I can get distracted by my family members. And so this is kind of, I take time to myself to pull out my book and find a place where I can be focused and reading. I'm going to choose to take notes because I know that I'm going to be quizzed on this. So I'm going to see if I can find some important facts about the chapter. I've told you all that there's often questions about setting, the development of characters, how the slave life is changing throughout the course of the novel. And then there's always going to be one question from the italic section. So, like, that's what I've said in class. So I'm going to be looking for those things too. So I have not looked at the quiz in a few weeks, so we're just going to read, and I'm going to do what I would normally do when I'm reading for academic purposes. Because remember, this is not just like reading for fun, this is reading with the intent of comprehending and being able to pass the reading quiz. So I'm going to start with the chapter. It says 5, and it's entitled Flight. So I'm going to put that in my notes. Chapter 5, Flight. I'm going to make some predictions here, like flight. I wonder what that means. Like, is someone running away here? Who's flighting? So that's like kind of confusing. Like some of our other ones have been titled like The Quarter was chapter 1, and that made sense because I learned really quickly that the quarter was where the slaves lived. Okay, so flight, I don't really know what that means. So we're going to find out. Every night in the quarter after the children were asleep, old Rit and Ben talked about Harriet. Old Rit started the conversation. What's going to happen to Minty? She asked. I remember Minty is the nickname for Harriet. Ben stirred under the ragged quilt and then turned over. You have to trust in the Lord, Rit. He'll take care of her. Rit ignored his reply. Here she is back on the plantation again. She's 7 years old and she hasn't learned anything special. You know the master isn't going to keep her around here, just kicking up her heels and eating her head off. What'll happen to her? So remember, she just got back home not that long ago. So now they're trying to figure out, like, is she going to be sent off again? Is she going to stay? I wonder what. This time, Ben did not answer. They both knew things weren't going well with the master. He needed money. He was hiring out more and more of his slaves each year. He was selling more and more of them each year. The plantation was beginning to have a ragged, uncared for look. So I'm going to stop there. So the main point of this part would be the plantation is struggling. Where does that leave Minty? The fences were down, honeysuckle and bullbriar were slowly taking over the big fields, the outbuildings needed repair. Rit touched Ben on the arm lightly to attract his attention. Then she whispered, The trader is back in Cambridge again. He's got the big front room at the tavern. Less than 2 months, and he's back again. He didn't used to come so often. And I remember from the back chapters that when the trader came into town from the south, the master usually sold some slaves and the trader would bring them back down, and that's like one way he made money. She waited for Ben to say something to reassure her. He knew, just as she did, that when the trader got ready to leave, some of the master's prime hands were sure to go with him. That's what I just thought as I was reading. Well, not exactly with him. They'd go with the chain gang, walking down that long, terrible road that ended in New Orleans or Natchez, chained 2 by 2, and another chain down through the middle of the group, and each slave chained to that too. She'd heard the white folks call it a coffle or drove, but to her it was always simply the chain gang. Okay, so that might be something that could come up. Chain gang. So it seems like 2 slaves are cuffed together, and then 2 more have to walk in front of them, cuffed together, and then everyone's kind of chained together. That's the chain gang. Chain gang. Okay, and it goes all the way in like New Orleans or Natchez. So to New Orleans, Natchez. Nothing's going to happen to Minty, old Ben said sharply. I'll see that it don't. The sharpness in his voice told her that he was thinking about the chain gang too, and remembering their two little ones, just about the size of Minty, who had gone away like that. Wow, so they already had kids who were sold to this. That'd be really difficult. One minute they had been carrying water to the field hands, and the next minute they were in a lot with the other slaves that had been sold. Sort of thrown in for good measure, and then gone with the chain gang. So again, I'm at the end of the page. I'm going to stop. Most of that page was about the chain gang, so I feel like I have that main idea. So I'm going to keep going. But there's nothing Ben can do, she thought. He can try, of course, but the trader had a reputation for driving a hard bargain. And if the master needed the money and one extra child meant a slightly better price for the lot, why, even Ben wouldn't be able to stop the sale. So then I'm going to think back and think Ben has some sway with the master. We know he's a really good worker, he's a hard worker, he's been put in charge of others. But even though he has like a good rapport with him, that doesn't mean he could be able to stop Harriet from leaving. That makes sense because of what she just said. Like a little more money for just one kid, like that's an easy decision for a master to make. Rick gave a long sigh. I wish the old days were back again, the days when the master was rich and just raised tobacco, just nothing but tobacco, and everybody worked. Even the little slaves helped squash those fat, juicy hornworms that get on the backside of the tobacco leaves, and everyone had plenty to eat, and we all felt safe. In the old days, the master never sold off any of his slaves. Everybody knew that, and Ben agreed with her. Yes, he said slowly. Things was better then. It seemed like they seesaw more now. He grows a little cotton, and he grows a little wheat, and he grows a little corn. Then maybe there's too much rain or not enough rain, so the crop's no good. Now he's selling the big timber off to shipbuilders. Pretty soon there won't be any more of them big stands of oaks. We keep hacking him down day after day. We're hacking him down. What's he going to do when his timber is gone? Okay, so we started with tobacco, and I'm just going to draw like a picture to remind myself. Tobacco to wheat. You know how good Miss Salzar is at drawing. And corn, I think. Yep, little wheat, little corn. That's my corn. And we know he sells timber. Okay, and that's what that whole page was about. So I'm going to keep going. You know what he's going to do, Rit said impatiently. He's going to keep on raising slaves and selling them off. He gets enough money just from that. He doesn't have to bother with his land work anymore. He's just living off the slaves. Living off his slaves, she thought. Ooh, I'm going to stop there. So I hear that phrase 2 times in a row. So that could be important. That at least signifies like a main idea. Remember repetition, when an author uses repetition, that shows significance. So I'm going to add the fact that he's also selling slaves. And I'm going to draw a big money sign over that because that is a big thing, right? It brings in a lot of money. Living off his slaves, she thought, and little Minty doesn't know how to cook or sew, and the slave trader is in Cambridge, and maybe tomorrow he'll be riding out here. Oh, Ben, she said, what's going to happen to Minty? I guess maybe we better pray to the good Lord to look out for her, he said. We just better pray. A few days later, Harriet was hired out again as a child's nurse. Rit said, may the Lord be praised. It's an answer to my prayer, to my prayer. May the Lord be praised. So she wasn't sold after all. She became a new job. She was hired as a child's nurse. All right. So here is a break here. So if I did need to break my chapter up into 2 sections because I didn't have enough time or because I had, a sports game tonight or whatever the reason was, here would be a good solid break to walk away for a minute because I'm not in the middle of a main idea, right? We never want to stop in the middle because then we might forget something that happened. So here would be like a good stretch break, right? And then come back right onto it. Once again, Harriet, the small girl in the tow linen shirt, barefooted, feet not touching the floor of the wagon, sat listening to the clip clop of horses' hoofs, listening to the creak of a wagon that was carrying her further and further away from home. Her forehead was wrinkled by a frown because she kept thinking, where am I going this time? How long will it take to get there? Why do I have to go anyway? She sounds just like a kid. Suppose she didn't like the people. What could she do about it? She wouldn't know how to get back home. Finally, the wagon stopped in front of a big house. She never did know where it was located, near what town, how far away from the Broadus plantation, but she soon knew what she was supposed to do. She looked after Miss Susan's baby and helped with the housework too. It wasn't a big family, just Miss Susan and her husband and the baby, and Miss Emily, a sister of Miss Susan's who was visiting. Okay, so here's some new characters. Whenever there's new characters, I want to stop and I want to make sure I understand all of the different like relationships. Okay, so here she's going to look after the baby. That's my baby. And she's going to do housework. So I'm going to draw like a sweeper. Okay, so the baby, we don't know the baby's name, but we do know that it's Miss Susan. So this is Susan. And we have her husband. And then we have Miss Emily, who's Miss Susan's sister. So coming from Miss Susan. All right, so I got all my new people. That first morning, Miss Susan told her to go and sweep the parlor and dust it. Okay, so Miss Susan is the woman who owns the house. Okay. Harriet was awed by the room. There was a thick carpet on the floor, soft and springy under her feet, like walking on layers of pine needles. And there were so many different kinds of chairs and tables, and the wood around the fireplace was carved into a pattern. She'd never seen anything like it. So this is kind of a nice house. Remember, Harriet hasn't really been inside a lot, so she probably had never really like felt carpet before, maybe even. She swept as hard as she could and then immediately dusted all the dark, shiny wood of the furniture. Miss Susan said, "Have you finished?" and came to run her fingers over the shiny surface of the chairs and tables. Her fingers were coated with dust. "Do it again," she snapped. "Are you just plain stupid? Why, you haven't dusted in here at all. You do it right, or—" Harriet swept again and then dusted, getting more and more frightened. Miss Susan said it wasn't done properly and went and got a whip and kept whipping her and shouting at her, and Harriet screamed. Okay, so Miss Susan, I want to put in her hand a whip because she seems super mean, right? So she's the one who whipped her after she didn't do whatever it was she was asked properly. She heard a voice calling, "Susan, Susan, what are you doing? What is the matter?" Miss Emily had heard the screams and came downstairs protesting. "Why do you whip the child, Susan, for not doing what she has never been taught to do? Leave her to me a few minutes and you will see that she will soon learn how to sweep and dust a room." Harriet learned how to clean the house. She looked after the baby, too. In later life, she said, "I was so little that I had to sit on the floor and have the baby put in my lap. That baby was always in my lap, except when it was asleep or its mother was feeding it." Okay, so Miss Emily, I'm going to put a book in her hand because she kind of like taught Harriet. She obviously didn't teach her to read, but she taught her how to clean the house. So she seems at least a little bit nicer than Miss Susan. Miss Susan said the baby mustn't be allowed to cry. Well, babies always cry. I don't think this is going to work out very well. Harriet had to keep rocking it so it wouldn't cry. Every night the same thing happened. She sat on the floor and rocked the cradle back and forth until the baby went to sleep. Then her head drooped, her eyelids closed, her hands started slipping away from the dark polished wood of the cradle. Finally, she slept on the floor by the cradle. Then the baby would wail suddenly, a thin, high, piercing sound. Miss Susan would wake up furious and reach for the whip she kept on the little shelf behind her bed. That's terrible. Okay, wait, we're at the end of a page, so we should stop. So, Harriet was whipped whenever baby cried. That's pretty much what that page is about. She didn't do her job, which we already said up here with the whip, and when the baby cried. Harriet finally reached a point in exhaustion where she was past needing sleep, where she snatched it in brief moments, head nodding, eyes closed, and yet not really asleep, prepared to start rocking the cradle before the baby woke up and cried. Even so, sometimes she went sound asleep to be awakened by the wailing of the baby. She was whipped so often that the back of her neck was covered with scars, crisscrossed with scars, so deep they would be visible for the rest of her life. Finally, she learned to sleep without really going to sleep, learned to listen while still asleep, head nodding, eyes closed, but all her senses alerted to the slightest movement from the cradle. Listening, listening, and yet asleep, so that if the baby stirred, she started rocking the cradle. Okay, so what did she learn from this experience? She learned how to sleep while staying alert. She thought of running away and didn't. She did not know how to reach the Broda's plantation, did not know in which direction to walk, assuming that she could have got away from the house. She had no idea how far it was. It had seemed an interminable journey when the overseer brought her to Miss Susan's in a wagon. Sometimes Miss Susan and her husband went out to parties. Then there were plumes on Miss Susan's bonnet, and she wore a silk dress, soft, swishy, and embroidered petticoats underneath, making a rustling sound when she walked. She smelled of orris root, and the master would smile at Miss Susan and toy with his watch chain. On those nights the baby cried and cried while Harriet slept. Harriet slept, and yet she was listening, sound asleep, but listening. Not for the baby, ears straining, even in sleep, for the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Not even footsteps, just the creak of the stairs, and she was awake because it meant Miss Susan was coming home. Thus, she learned to stay alert, even though she was deeply, restfully asleep. Okay, so that kind of goes with this. She learned how to sleep while staying alert, and she only got a break when Miss Susan went to party hat. That's my party hat. You could also just write the word party, but that helps me remember, right? Little pictures. All right, let's see. During the day, she toyed with the idea of running away. Then she would thrust the thought from her as impossible. Yet she did run away. Years afterward, she described what happened in these words. One morning after breakfast, Miss Susan had the baby, and I stood by the table waiting until I was to take it. Near me was a bowl of lumps of white sugar. My mistress got into a great quarrel with her husband. She had an awful temper. I mean, yeah, she whips her all the time. And she would scold and storm and call him all kinds of names. Now, you know, I never had anything good. No sweet, no sugar, and that sugar right by me did look so nice, and my mistress's back was turned to me while she was fighting with her husband. So I just put my fingers in the sugar bowl to take one lump, and maybe she heard me, for she turned and saw me. The next minute, she had the rawhide down. I gave one jump out the door, and I saw that they came after me, but I just flew, and they didn't catch me. I ran, and I ran, and I passed many a house, but I didn't dare stop, for they all knew my mistress, and they would send me back. Okay, so she did run away. I'm going to start with that. So ran away after getting caught stealing sugar. She ran until she was exhausted. She kept looking over her shoulder. After a while, she didn't see Miss Susan and her husband. She decided that they must have got tired and stopped chasing her. She slowed her pace, then at the thought of having to go back to Miss Susan, whatever form of punishment she and her husband would have devised, she started running again. She said, by and by, when I was almost tuckered out, I came to a great big pig pen. There was an old sow there, and perhaps 8 or 10 little pigs. I was too little to climb into it, but I tumbled over the high part and fell in on the ground. I was so beaten out that I could not stir. Oh, shoot. All right, so she hid in pig pen. That's gotta smell. And there I stayed from Friday until the next Tuesday, fighting with those little pigs for the potato peelings and the other scraps that came down in the trough. The old Zoe would push me away when I tried to get her children's food, and I was awfully afraid of her. By Tuesday, I was so starved that I knew I had to go back to my mistress. I didn't have anywhere else to go, even though I knew what was coming, so I went back. So I'm going to make a prediction. She's going to get whipped. Okay, so Friday, she was there until Tuesday. That's like a long time. So Friday to Tuesday. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like almost 5 days. Oh, and that's the end. Okay, so all we know is she hid in the pig pen from Friday to Tuesday, and we know that she went back. We don't know, that must be in the next chapter, but that's kind of the point of that page. Okay, so now I went through all the pages and we've come to this italics part, which Miss Salazar said there will always be a question, or at least almost always. So I'm going to read this. That same year, 1827, Henry Clay, who was still Secretary of State, appealed to the Canadian government again. He asked for some kind of agreement in regard to the return of hundreds of fugitive slaves living in Canada. After 5 months had gone by, the Canadian said, "It is utterly impossible to agree to a stipulation for the surrender of fugitive slaves." In the city of New York, two Negroes, John Russwurm and the Reverend Mr. Samuel Cornish, began to publish Freedom's Journal, the first Negro newspaper in the United States. Okay, so there's kind of two thoughts here, right? Okay, so I have, and I'm going to put italics because I know a question's going to come from here. Okay, so there's 2 points. The first point would be we have Henry Clay appealed to the Canadian government. I'm pretty sure that happened in the last italics of the last chapter, so this is kind of like ongoing, right? So I think the Canadians, like last chapter, had said, like, yes, we saw it, right? So this time they said it's utterly impossible to agree to a stipulation after 5 months. Okay, so Clay, Henry Clay, to Canada, and Canada said, utterly impossible. 5 months. Okay, so those are some details and the main idea altogether. And then we have in the city of New York, two Negroes, John Russwurm and Reverend Mr. Samuel Cornish, began to publish Freedom's Journal, the first Negro newspaper. Okay, so our second point is we have the first Negro newspaper. That seems like a big deal. So that would be like the first newspaper published by a black person, newspaper. There we go. It's called Freedom's Journal. And the authors of that would be Russwurm and Cornish. There you go. Now you can see all my notes. Okay, so I'm going to move my notes over for just a second. And I'm going to flip them over. Watch out. Okay, so I'm at the end of my chapter and I summarized all the main points as I went. So I'm just going to go over those again. We have the plantation is struggling. Where does that leave Menti? That was like her mom's worry. They were worried specifically about the chain gang, and I know what that is now. We know they were worried because the farm used to grow tobacco and it did well then, but ever since then it's been growing like wheat and corn and timber and all these things, and yet it doesn't seem to be doing well. But Minty didn't get sold. She got hired as a child's nurse under Miss Susan and her husband. We also have a new character of Miss Emily. So she took care of the baby and cleaned the house. She was whipped whenever the baby cried, and that really taught her how to sleep while staying alert, including the nights when Miss Susan went to parties. She got a break because she didn't have to deal with the baby. She could just let the baby cry, but she had to make sure when Miss Susan was back, she went back to work. Let's see. She ran away after getting caught stealing sugar. She hid in a pig pen for a lot of days, 5 days, and then she went back, and we don't know what happened after that. At the end, we know that the United States is still trying to convince Canada to send back the slaves who have escaped there, and Canada ignored them for a long time for 5 months. And then it's like, it's utterly impossible. And we have our first Negro newspaper called the Freedom's Journal, and that's by Russworm and Cornish. Okay, so that's where I would stop for tonight. And I would say, all right, I'm good. I did my chapter. But I wouldn't stop there. Tomorrow morning, right before my quiz at 9:40, I know my quiz is at 9:40, so it's sometime when I get to school at 8:45 to 9:20 when Mr. Philby starts morning meeting and all the other things, I would look at this again and I would review it and I would do exactly like I just did. So what I just did was retelling the story, right? Retelling the chapter. And when you retell something, you can make sure that you understand it. If I can retell my chapter straight from my notes, then I've gone through all of the points of my notes. Do you have to take notes? Absolutely not. If you just want to stop and you like think through each one, but the notes allow you the next day if you're someone who like struggles with remembering it 24 hours later, or if you like read the chapter on Saturday because you're like ahead of the game and it's not till Tuesday, or let's say we have 2 nights to read this chapter, so you read it on Wednesday, but the chapter's not till Friday. It kind of gives you some leeway to remembering again right before your quiz. Okay. All right, so I hoped that this read aloud, which is kind of like a think aloud with Miss Salazar, helped you, and hopefully you'll do really well on your quiz for chapter 5.